In the last video, we spoke about how there are two ways to get information into a context object and two ways to get information out. We're now going to start to focus on creating a context object inside of our application that's going to communicate the currently selected language from our app component down to both the button and the field components. So to get started, I'm going to flip back over to my code editor. Inside of my src directory, I'm going to make a new folder called contexts, like so. Notice that this is a directory that is a sibling to components. Inside the context directory, I'm then going to create a new file called language.context.js. The purpose of this file is to create a context object and export it. The reason we are putting this into a separate file is that we can import the context object into only the component files that we care about. In our application, we only want to connect this context object to our app component and the button and the field. No other component needs to get access to the language context. So that is why we are creating it inside of a separate file. It's so that we can only make use of it where we actually want to connect it. Then to create my context object, I'm going to import React from React at the top of the file, and then I will simply say export default react.createContext, like so. And that is pretty much it. That is all we have to do to create a context object. Like I said, the challenge in understanding context is not in creating it, it is understanding how we get information into it and out of it. That's the real challenge. So now that we have created our context object, we are going to get some information into the object by setting up a default value. We can create a default value by passing it directly into the createContext call. So into createContext right here, I'm going to pass a string of English, like so. So that's going to indicate to my two components, or my two nested children of the field and the button, that by default, the selected language that we should be showing on the screen is English. So the default value for the context object is the string English. Now that we have put a default value into the context object, we are going to connect it to our button component first. We're going to have to do the same process for the field, but we'll start with the button. We're going to connect that context object to our nested child of button by making use of this.context property. So we're going to be making use of this.context to get information out of the context object, rather than creating this consumer component thing over here. We'll talk about why we will use a consumer component later on. Okay, so inside of my components directory, I will find my button.js file. And then at the top, I'm going to import the language context object that we just created. So I'm going to import language context from up1 directory, contexts, make sure you get the S on there if you spelt the directory name over here with an S as well. And then I'm going to import the language context file, like so. Now to hook up the language context object to my button component, let's look at a quick diagram. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to first set up something called a context type. That is going to essentially link our button component to the context object. And then to actually reference the information that is inside of the context object, we're going to make use of the this.context property. So again, the first thing we have to do is set up this context type property. Back inside of my component file, I'm going to add a little bit of space inside of my component class, and then I will add in static context type equals language context, like so. So this is how we hook up a context object to a class component. We say static context type, and then we just print out the context object itself that we had created inside that other file. Now, remember, the context type property here, much like many other properties we have created inside of React components, is a very special property name. So if you call this anything else, this context stuff is not going to work correctly. If you call this something like my context type, nope, not going to work. It has to be called exactly context type, like so. Now, you may have not ever seen the static keyword syntax before. Essentially, what static context type right here does is it adds a property to our class itself. Remember, anytime that we create an instance of a component by writing out something like button inside of JSX, that is creating an instance of the button class. Anytime that we add methods to a class, or anytime that we update, say, our state property or anything like that, we are changing properties that are assigned to an instance of our class. When we make use of the static keyword right here, we are adding a property directly to the class itself. So the line of code that you see right there is identical to writing out button.contextType equals language context. You can set up a context type property by making use of either methods that you see right here. So we can write out either static context type inside of the class declaration, or after creating the class, we can then write out the class name .context type and then hook up the context like so. You can do it either way, totally up to you. Personally, I like making use of the static context type because it puts that declaration at the very top of the file. Very easy to read, very easy to find. So now that we have added a reference of context type to our context object to our component class can now reference this.context and get access to the data inside of that context object, which in this case is the string English. So to make sure that's the case, I'm going to find my render method, and inside there, I'm going to console log out this.context like so. All right, so now it's time to test this out. I'm going to save the button.js file. I'm going to save the language context.js file, and then I'll flip back over to my browser. I'm going to make sure I refresh the page, and then when I do so, I should see a console log over here of the string English. All right, so that's pretty much it. That is a very basic example. We have now created a context object. We got a default value into it by passing the default value into the context object when we created it, and then we got that default value out of that context object by setting up the context type property to link our component to the context object, and then we got reference to the actual data inside the context object with this.context. Now, one thing I want to make kind of clear here is that I'm giving you like a super detailed academic definition of what's going on. So if it feels like this is kind of confusing, I want to tell you it's really not. You know, at the end of the day, let's just like really simplify this. Create the context object, define context type, boom, you get this.context. That's it. That's all that's really going on. All right, now the last thing I want to show you very quickly is that we can very easily change the string that we make use of when we create our context to change the default value inside that context object. So for example, rather than passing in a string of English, I could say simply Dutch. So if I change that and then save the file, we can flip back over and I'll see a console log of Dutch. We do not have to pass in strings to a context object for values that get shared. We can use any type of valid JavaScript value. So we can do an object with a color of red. So I can save that and I'll see color of red. We can do an array that has 1, 2, 3. So I can save that and see 1, 2, 3 over here. So I think you get the idea pretty quickly. We can share any information that we want inside of our context object. But for our application, it makes sense to have a default value of English. Okay, so now that we've got a very simple example put together, let's take a quick pause. When we come back to the next section, we're going to make sure that our button component updates itself based upon that context property. And then after that, we'll make sure that we repeat the same process for our field component as well. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.